In the gilded corridors of Valdoria's ancient palace, where centuries-old secrets echo through marble halls, a single scream pierces the morning silence. What begins as a routine security check spirals into a web of betrayal, hidden alliances, and dangerous truths that could topple a kingdom. Sometimes the greatest threats to a crown don't come from outside the palace walls. They come from within. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ornate corridors of Valdoria Palace as Captain Marcus Thorne adjusted his ceremonial sword and began his daily rounds. 20 years of service to the royal family had taught him that even the most peaceful mornings could harbor danger. But nothing had prepared him for what would unfold on this seemingly ordinary Tuesday. Princess Elena Valdoria, age 12, had always been known for her spirited nature and curious mind. Unlike her older brother Prince Alexander, who dutifully attended his lessons without question, Elena possessed an insatiable desire to explore every hidden corner of their ancestral home. Her governess, Lady Margaret Ashford, often joked that keeping track of the princess was like trying to catch morning mist in a butterfly net. The trouble began at precisely 8:30 in the morning when Elena failed to appear for her scheduled breakfast with the queen consort, Lady Isabella Valdoria. Isabella, who had married into the royal family 5 years earlier after the tragic death of the late queen, maintained strict schedules for all royal children. Her attention to protocol and order had earned her respect among the palace staff, though some whispered that her methods were perhaps too rigid for children. Lady Margaret knocked gently on Elena's bedroom door, expecting to find the princess still buried under her silk covers, dreading another morning of etiquette lessons. Instead, she discovered an empty room with bedsheets thrown haphazardly across the floor and the window slightly ajar. A cool morning breeze rustled the curtains, carrying with it the scent of the palace gardens and a growing sense of unease. The governess immediately contacted the queen consort's private secretary, who in turn alerted Captain Thorne. Palace protocol dictated that any unexplained absence of a royal family member, no matter how minor, required immediate investigation. The captain assembled a small team of his most trusted guards and began a systematic search of the palace grounds. Elena, meanwhile, had discovered something that would change everything. During one of her unauthorized explorations the previous evening, she had stumbled upon a loose stone in the wall behind an old tapestry in the east wing. Behind it, she found a collection of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. The elegant handwriting and official seal suggested they were correspondence of significant importance, but Elena's reading skills, while advanced for her age, couldn't fully comprehend their contents. What she could understand, however, were the repeated mentions of her stepmother's name and references to the arrangement and securing the succession. The letters were signed with an initial she didn't recognize, but the tone suggested intimate knowledge of palace affairs. Confused and somewhat frightened by her discovery, Elena had hidden the letters in a place she considered absolutely safe, inside the hidden compartment of an antique jewelry box in her stepmother's private bathroom. The young princess had intended to examine the letters more carefully that morning, perhaps even ask her tutor, Professor Davidson, to help her understand their meaning. She knew from her history lessons that royal correspondence often contained important political information, and these letters felt particularly significant. With the innocence of childhood, she believed she had stumbled upon some sort of historical treasure that her stepmother would want to know about. At 9:15, Elena quietly slipped into the queen consort's private chambers while Isabella attended her morning meeting with the palace administrator. The bathroom adjoining the royal bedroom was a masterpiece of marble and gold, with fixtures that had been installed during the renovation following Isabella's marriage to the king. Elena had always admired the ornate jewelry box that sat atop the vanity, with its intricate carvings and secret compartment that Isabella had once shown her during a rare moment of maternal warmth. As Elena carefully opened the hidden compartment to retrieve the letters, she made a discovery that sent ice through her young veins. The compartment wasn't empty as she had left it the night before. Instead, it contained documents that bore official government seals, photographs of people she didn't recognize, and what appeared to be detailed floor plans of the palace. Even more disturbing were several sheets of paper covered with notes written in Isabella's distinctive handwriting, mentioning dates, times, and locations within the palace. The 12-year-old princess might not have understood the full implications of what she was seeing, but she possessed enough intelligence to recognize that these items seemed secretive and potentially dangerous. Her stepmother had always maintained that she had no interest in politics, claiming she preferred to focus on charitable works and social functions. Yet here was evidence of what appeared to be extensive political planning and surveillance. Elena's hands trembled as she photographed several of the documents with a small digital camera she had received for her birthday. She had originally brought it to take pictures of the letters she had hidden, thinking it would help her remember the details when she discussed them with a trusted adult. Now, faced with this new discovery, she felt compelled to document everything, though she couldn't quite explain why. As she carefully returned the documents to their original positions, Elena heard footsteps approaching in the outer chamber. Panic seized her as she realized that Isabella had returned earlier than expected. The princess quickly closed the jewelry box and looked around desperately for a hiding place. The bathroom offered limited options, and she could hear her stepmother's voice clearly now, speaking in low tones with someone Elena couldn't identify. With nowhere else to go, Elena squeezed herself into the narrow space behind the large marble bathtub, pressing her small body against the cool stone and hoping the shadows would conceal her presence. Her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give her away, but she remained perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. Isabella entered the bathroom with another woman whose voice Elena recognized as belonging to Victoria Chambers, the palace's head of communications. Their conversation immediately took on an urgent, hushed quality that made Elena strain to hear every word. "The situation is becoming more complicated than we anticipated," Victoria was saying. "There are questions being raised about the timing of certain appointments, and some members of parliament are starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the new security protocols." Isabella's response chilled Elena to the bone. "We knew this day would come eventually. The important thing is that everything remains on schedule. Has there been any indication that anyone suspects our true purpose?" "Not yet, but we need to be more careful. The king's brother has been asking questions about the changes to the succession documents, and Captain Thor mentioned that he's noticed some irregularities in the guard rotations you've requested." Elena didn't fully understand the political implications of what she was hearing, but she knew enough about royal protocol to recognize that discussions about succession and security should involve the king directly. The fact that her stepmother was having these conversations in secret, combined with the hidden documents, painted a picture that terrified her young mind. "What about the children?" Isabella asked, and Elena's blood ran cold at the casual tone in which her stepmother discussed her and her brother. "Alexander is completely oblivious, as usual. He's so focused on his military training and his upcoming ceremonial duties that he hasn't noticed anything unusual." Elena, however, is more observant. Her governess mentioned that she's been asking questions about palace history and succession laws during her lessons. Elena has always been too curious for her own good. Isabella replied with a coldness that made the princess shrink further into her hiding place. "Perhaps it's time we considered additional measures to ensure she doesn't become a complication." The two women continued their conversation for several more minutes, discussing details that Elena couldn't fully comprehend, but which clearly involved elaborate planning and coordination with people outside the palace. When they finally left the bathroom, Elena remained hidden for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, too frightened to move. When she finally emerged from her hiding place, Elena's mind raced with questions and fears. The innocent letter she had discovered the previous evening now seemed insignificant compared to what she had witnessed. Her stepmother, who had always maintained a somewhat distant but proper relationship with her, was clearly involved in something that required secrecy and deception. Elena knew she needed to tell someone about what she had discovered, but the weight of the situation seemed enormous for a 12-year-old to bear. She couldn't approach Isabella directly, as that would reveal that she had been eavesdropping and snooping through private belongings. Her father, the king, was traveling on a diplomatic mission and wouldn't return for several days. Prince Alexander, while loving toward his sister, was often dismissive of what he considered her childish concerns. As Elena made her way back toward her own chambers, she encountered Lady Margaret, who had been searching for her with increasing anxiety. The governess's relief at finding the princess safe quickly turned to concern when she noticed Elena's pale complexion and obvious distress. "Your Highness, where have you been? The entire staff has been looking for you. The Queen Consort is quite upset about your absence for breakfast." Elena looked into Lady Margaret's kind face felt a desperate urge to confess everything she had discovered. Lady Margaret had been with the royal family since before Elena's birth, and the princess trusted her completely. However, the magnitude of what she had witnessed made her hesitate. If her suspicions about Isabella were correct, then sharing this information could put Lady Margaret in danger as well. "I was just exploring the library," Elena lied, hating herself for the deception, but unable to see any alternative. "I lost track of time reading about palace history." Lady Margaret studied the princess's face carefully. After years of caring for royal children, she had developed an acute ability to detect when they were being less than truthful. However, Elena's obvious distress suggested that whatever had happened was more serious than a simple case of tardiness. "Princess, if something has upset you, you know you can tell me anything. It's my job to protect you and ensure your well-being." For a moment, Elena wavered on the edge of confession. The temptation to share her burden with a trusted adult was almost overwhelming. However, the memory of Isabella's cold tone when discussing additional measures regarding Elena gave her pause. If her stepmother was capable of planning something that required such secrecy, then she might also be capable of more direct action against anyone who threatened her plans. "I'm fine, Lady Margaret. Perhaps I'm just feeling a bit unwell. Could I rest in my chambers for a while?" The governess agreed, though her concerned expression made it clear that she wasn't entirely convinced by Elena's explanation. As they walked toward the princess's room, Elena's mind continued to race with possibilities and plans. She needed to document what she had discovered and find a way to get the information to someone who could act on it without putting herself or others in immediate danger. Back in her chambers, Elena sat at her small writing desk and began to compose a detailed account of everything she had seen and heard. Her hands shook as she wrote, partly from fear and partly from the overwhelming responsibility she felt. At 12 years old, she was grappling with the possibility that the woman who had married her father and become her stepmother might be involved in something that could threaten the very foundations of their kingdom. As she wrote, Elena began to develop a plan. She would continue to gather evidence, while being extremely careful not to arouse suspicion. The digital camera hidden in her room would allow her to document anything else she discovered, and she would find a way to contact someone outside the palace who could help her understand the full implications of what she had uncovered. The princess had no way of knowing that her stepmother had already begun to suspect that someone had been in her private chambers. Isabella's years of careful planning had made her extremely sensitive to any signs that her security had been compromised, and she had noticed subtle changes in the arrangement of items in her jewelry box. As Elena finished writing her account and hid it carefully among her school papers, she heard commotion in the corridor outside her room. Voices were raised in urgent discussion, and she could make out Captain Thorne's distinctive authoritative tone giving orders to his guards. The princess pressed her ear to her bedroom door, straining to hear what was being said. The words that reached her sent a new wave of fear through her young heart. There had been a security breach in the queen consort's private chambers, and the entire palace was being searched for evidence of an intruder. Elena realized with growing horror that her morning exploration had been discovered far more quickly than she had anticipated. As the sounds of the search grew closer to her own chambers, she made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would forever change the fate of the kingdom of Valdoria. The palace erupted into controlled chaos as Captain Thorne's security team implemented emergency protocols. Elena pressed herself against her bedroom door, listening to the organized confusion that filled the corridors. Guards moved with military precision, their boots echoing against marble floors as they conducted their systematic search. The princess realized that her careful morning reconnaissance had triggered a full-scale security investigation. Isabella stood in her private chambers, maintaining perfect composure while internally calculating the potential damage. She had discovered the breach within minutes of returning from her meeting with Victoria Chambers. Years of clandestine activities had honed her instincts to detect even the smallest disturbances in her carefully arranged private spaces. Someone had been in her bathroom, had touched her jewelry box, and, most alarmingly, might have discovered the hidden compartment. "Captain Thorne," Isabella addressed the security chief with the regal authority she had perfected since becoming queen consort. "I want to know exactly how someone gained access to my private chambers. This represents a serious breach of royal security." Marcus Thorne, a veteran of 2 decades protecting the royal family, nodded grimly. He had served under 3 monarchs and had never encountered such a brazen invasion of the royal family's private quarters. The fact that nothing appeared to have been stolen made the incident even more troubling, as it suggested motives beyond simple theft. Your Majesty, we're conducting a comprehensive investigation. Every member of the palace staff who had access to this wing today is being questioned. We're also reviewing all security footage from the corridors, though unfortunately, the private chambers themselves aren't monitored for obvious privacy reasons. Isabella nodded, her mind working quickly to assess potential threats. The hidden documents in her jewelry box contained information that could unravel years of careful planning. If they had been discovered and photographed, she would need to accelerate her timeline significantly. However, she couldn't reveal her concerns about the specific contents without exposing herself. Have you considered the possibility that this might be connected to someone within the royal family itself? Isabella suggested carefully. The children, for instance, are known to explore areas where they shouldn't be. Princess Elena, in particular, has always been curious about palace history and hidden passages. Captain Thorne frowned at the suggestion. While it was true that Princess Elena had a reputation for exploration, the idea of a 12-year-old conducting sophisticated surveillance seemed unlikely. However, he couldn't ignore any possibility when it came to royal security. We'll certainly investigate that avenue, Your Majesty. Though I should mention that Princess Elena was reported missing from her chambers earlier this morning, around the same time frame when this breach likely occurred. Isabella's expression remained perfectly controlled, but internally she felt a surge of cold satisfaction. If Elena had indeed been the intruder, it would provide the perfect justification for the additional measures she had discussed with Victoria. A curious child who stumbled upon sensitive information could be easily managed, especially if her activities could be framed as reckless behavior that endangered palace security. Meanwhile, Elena remained in her chambers, her heart pounding as she listened to the investigation unfolding outside her door. Lady Margaret had positioned herself protectively near the princess's room, clearly concerned about Elena's earlier distressed state and the current security crisis. The princess knew it was only a matter of time before the investigation reached her. Captain Thorne would undoubtedly question her about her morning activities, and Elena wasn't sure how long she could maintain her story about spending time in the library. The palace library was monitored by security cameras, and a quick check would reveal that she hadn't been there at all. As Elena contemplated her limited options, she heard a gentle knock on her door. Lady Margaret's voice called softly, "Princess, Captain Thorne would like to speak with you about this morning's events. May we come in?" Elena took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and opened the door with what she hoped appeared to be normal curiosity about the commotion. Captain Thorne entered with his characteristic measured steps, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the princess's demeanor. "Princess Elena, I apologize for the disruption, but we're investigating a security incident that occurred earlier today. I need to ask you some questions about your activities this morning." "Of course, Captain Thorne, though I'm not sure how I can help with a security matter." Elena was proud of how steady her voice sounded, despite the fear churning in her stomach. "You were absent from your scheduled breakfast with the Queen consort this morning. Lady Margaret found your chambers empty around 8:30. Can you tell me where you were during that time?" Elena had anticipated this question and had prepared her response carefully. "I went to the library to research some material for my history lessons. Professor Davidson assigned us to learn about palace architecture and hidden passages, so I was looking through the old architectural books." Captain Thorne made notes in his small leather notebook, a habit that had served him well throughout his career. "The library, you say? And did anyone see you there? Perhaps the librarian or any of the research staff?" "I didn't see anyone else. I went to the section with the oldest books, in the back corner where it's very quiet. I often go there when I want to read without interruption." Elena's lie felt more substantial with each detail she added, but she knew that too many specifics could also arouse suspicion. "Princess, someone gained unauthorized access to the Queen Consort's private chambers this morning. This represents a serious security breach. If you saw anything unusual during your time in the library, or if you noticed anyone in areas where they shouldn't have been, it's very important that you tell me." Elena met Captain Thorne's steady gaze, trying to project the innocent confusion of a child who had no idea why such questions were being asked. "I didn't see anyone unusual, Captain. Is everyone safe? Is my stepmother all right?" The genuine concern in Elena's voice impressed both Captain Thorne and Lady Margaret. The princess's relationship with her stepmother had always been somewhat formal, but she clearly cared about Isabella's well-being. "Everyone is fine, princess. We're simply being thorough in our investigation." Captain Thorne closed his notebook and prepared to leave. "If you remember anything else about this morning, anything at all that seemed out of place, please let Lady Margaret know immediately." After the captain left, Elena sank into her reading chair, emotionally exhausted from the stress of lying to someone she respected. Lady Margaret sat beside her, clearly sensing that the princess was struggling with something more significant than the security investigation. "Elena, dear, you seem very upset about all this. I know the palace is in chaos right now, but you're safe. Captain Thorne and his team will sort everything out." The princess looked into Lady Margaret's kind face and felt the weight of her secrets pressing down on her. The temptation to confess everything was almost overwhelming, but the memory of Isabella's cold discussion about additional measures kept her silent. "Lady Margaret, hypothetically speaking, if someone discovered something important but dangerous, and they weren't sure who they could trust with the information, what should they do?" The governess studied Elena's face carefully, recognizing that this wasn't an abstract philosophical question. Years of caring for royal children had taught her to read between the lines of their seemingly innocent inquiries. "That's a very mature question, princess. I suppose such a person would need to carefully consider who has both the power to act on the information and the integrity to use it responsibly. Sometimes the most important thing isn't who you tell, but when and how you tell them." Elena absorbed this advice, recognizing the wisdom in Lady Margaret's words. She needed to be strategic about revealing what she had discovered, ensuring that the information reached someone who could protect her while investigating her suspicions about Isabella. As afternoon approached, the palace gradually returned to its normal rhythm, though an undercurrent of tension remained. Isabella had met privately with Victoria Chambers again, this time in the secure conference room used for sensitive political discussions. The two women needed to assess the potential damage and adjust their plans accordingly. "The security investigation is proceeding as expected," Victoria reported. "Captain Thorne questioned all staff members with access to your chambers, as well as both royal children." Princess Elena claimed she was in the library during the relevant time period. Claimed. Isabella picked up on the subtle emphasis in Victoria's words. The library security footage shows no sign of her presence during the morning hours. She either lied about her whereabouts or was somehow able to avoid the cameras entirely. Isabella felt a cold satisfaction at this confirmation of her suspicions. Elena's deception proved that the princess had indeed been somewhere she shouldn't have been, most likely in Isabella's private chambers. The question now was how much the curious 12-year-old had discovered and what she intended to do with the information. "We need to accelerate our timeline," Isabella decided. "If Elena discovered anything significant, she'll eventually find a way to share it with someone who might take action. We can't risk any delays now. That will require moving up several key appointments and communications. Are you certain we're ready?" Isabella considered the question carefully. Years of planning had prepared her for various contingencies, but a discovery by a royal child wasn't among the scenarios they had anticipated. However, Elena's age and position actually provided some advantages. Who would believe accusations from a 12-year-old against the queen consort? And if Elena became too troublesome, there were ways to address a curious child that wouldn't arouse the same suspicions as actions against adult threats. "Contact our allies immediately. Tell them we're implementing the accelerated schedule. Everything that was planned for next month will happen within the next week." Victoria nodded, though Isabella could see the concern in her experienced political operative's eyes. Rushing complex plans always introduced additional risks, but they had reached a point where delay might be even more dangerous. As evening approached, Elena sat at her writing desk, continuing to document everything she had observed. Her account now filled several pages, and she had begun to develop a more sophisticated understanding of the implications. Her history lessons had included extensive study of palace coups and political conspiracies throughout various kingdoms, and she was beginning to recognize patterns in Isabella's behavior that matched historical examples of internal threats. The princess had decided that she needed to gather more evidence before approaching anyone with her suspicions. Captain Thorne seemed honest and dedicated, but he worked closely with Isabella and might feel obligated to report Elena's accusations directly to her stepmother. Professor Davidson was knowledgeable about political history, but he was ultimately an employee of the palace and might not have the authority or connections to investigate properly. Elena's thoughts turned to her uncle, Prince Richard, the king's younger brother. Uncle Richard had always been kind to her, and his position as a senior member of the royal family would give him both the authority and the motivation to investigate threats to the monarchy. However, he lived in his own estate several hours away from the palace, and Elena had no way to contact him directly without going through palace communication systems that might be monitored. As Elena contemplated her options, she heard familiar voices in the corridor outside her chambers. Isabella was speaking with someone Elena didn't immediately recognize, their conversation too quiet for her to make out specific words. However, the urgent tone and late hour suggested that whatever they were discussing was both important and secretive. The princess quietly opened her door, just far enough to peer into the corridor. Isabella stood with a tall man in an expensive suit whom Elena had never seen before. Their body language suggested intense discussion, and Isabella kept glancing toward Elena's door as if aware that they might be overheard. Elena carefully closed her door and returned to her desk, adding this new observation to her growing documentation. Mysterious late-night meetings, hidden documents, secret communications with political operatives, and discussions about succession and security measures painted a picture that terrified her young mind. As she prepared for bed, Elena made a decision that would set in motion the final act of this dangerous game. She would continue gathering evidence for one more day, then find a way to contact Uncle Richard directly. The princess had remembered that he was scheduled to attend a public ceremony in the capital city the following afternoon, an event that was always covered extensively by news media. Elena's plan was simple, but dangerous. She would find a way to attend the ceremony, approach Uncle Richard in full view of the public and press, and share her concerns with him directly. The public setting would provide protection from immediate retaliation, and Uncle Richard's political experience would help him understand the implications of her discoveries. What Elena didn't know was that Isabella had already begun implementing her own plan to neutralize the threat posed by the curious princess. The mysterious man in the corridor had been Dr. Marcus Webb, a respected physician who specialized in treating nervous conditions in children. Isabella had spent the evening convincing him that Princess Elena was showing signs of dangerous psychological instability that required immediate intervention. As the palace settled into the quiet rhythms of night, both Elena and Isabella prepared for what would prove to be the climactic confrontation that would determine the future of the kingdom. The innocent curiosity that had led a 12-year-old princess to explore hidden passages had uncovered a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of the monarchy. The stage was set for a final act that would test whether youth and innocence could triumph over experience and calculated ambition. The fate of the kingdom would ultimately rest in the hands of a child who had stumbled upon secrets too dangerous for her to fully comprehend, but too important for her to ignore. Dawn broke over Valdoria Palace with an unsettling stillness that seemed to magnify every small sound. Elena had barely slept, her mind continuously replaying the events of the previous day and rehearsing her planned approach to Uncle Richard. She dressed carefully in her most formal day dress, knowing that her appearance at the public ceremony would need to project both royal dignity and urgent concern. Isabella, meanwhile, had spent the early morning hours in secure communications with her network of allies. Dr. Webb's assessment had provided her with the perfect cover story. Princess Elena was suffering from childhood paranoid delusions, possibly triggered by the stress of her father's absence and the recent changes in palace routine. The respected physician's professional opinion would lend credibility to any actions Isabella might need to take to protect the kingdom from what she would frame as a disturbed child's dangerous fantasies. At breakfast, the atmosphere in the royal dining room carried an electric tension that even the carefully trained palace staff could sense. Elena maintained her composure, engaging in polite conversation with Isabella while internally preparing for what she knew would be her only opportunity to expose the truth. "Princess," Isabella said with perfect maternal concern, "Lady Margaret mentioned that you seemed distressed yesterday after all the security commotion. I've arranged for Dr. Webb, a specialist in childhood psychology, to speak with you this afternoon. I think it would be beneficial for you to discuss any anxieties you might be experiencing." Elena felt ice form in her stomach. The suggestion of psychological evaluation was clearly not a request, and the timing would perfectly prevent her from attending Uncle Richard's ceremony. Isabella's move was brilliant in its simplicity. Who would question a stepmother's concern for a child's mental health? That's very thoughtful of you, Elena replied carefully, but I was hoping to attend Uncle Richard's ceremony today. I've been looking forward to it, and I think the public engagement might actually help me feel more normal after yesterday's excitement. Isabella's smile remained perfectly calibrated, but Elena caught a brief flash of calculation in her stepmother's eyes. I'm afraid that won't be possible, dear. Dr. Webb has limited availability, and your well-being must take priority over public appearances. Perhaps you can attend one of your uncle's ceremonies after you're feeling better. The finality in Isabella's tone made it clear that this was not a negotiation. Elena realized that her stepmother had effectively trapped her, using the appearance of maternal care to isolate her from potential allies. The princess needed to act quickly before her opportunities disappeared entirely. If you'll excuse me, Elena said, rising from her chair with practiced royal grace, I'd like to prepare some notes about my feelings for Dr. Webb. I want to be as helpful as possible during our discussion. Isabella nodded approvingly. What a mature attitude, princess. I'm sure Dr. Webb will be impressed by your cooperation. Elena returned to her chambers with her mind racing. She had perhaps 2 hours before Dr. Webb's arrival, and she suspected that once the psychological evaluation began, she would find herself under much closer supervision. The princess needed to implement her backup plan immediately. Rather than trying to reach Uncle Richard at the public ceremony, Elena decided to document everything she had discovered and find a way to get the information to someone who could act on it quickly. Her target was Captain Thorne, despite the risks involved in approaching someone so closely connected to Isabella. Elena spent the next hour creating a comprehensive written account of everything she had witnessed, including detailed descriptions of the hidden documents, photographs she had taken, transcripts of the conversation she had overheard, and her analysis of the pattern she had observed. She wrote with the clarity and precision that her tutors had cultivated, ensuring that anyone reading her account would understand both the facts and their implications. The princess also prepared physical evidence to support her claims. The photographs from her digital camera were downloaded and printed using the small printer in her study alcove. She carefully organized everything into a package that could be quickly reviewed and verified by someone with the appropriate knowledge and authority. Elena's plan was audacious in its simplicity. She would request a private meeting with Captain Thorne under the pretense of wanting to confess something about yesterday's security breach. Once alone with him, she would present her evidence and ask for his protection while he conducted a proper investigation. The risk was enormous. If Captain Thorne reported her accusations directly to Isabella, Elena would find herself completely isolated and vulnerable to whatever additional measures her stepmother might consider necessary. However, the princess had observed Captain Thorne carefully over the years, and she believed his dedication to royal security would outweigh his personal loyalty to Isabella. At 10:30 in the morning, Elena sent word through Lady Margaret that she needed to speak with Captain Thorne about an important matter related to the previous day's investigation. She specifically requested privacy, explaining that she had information that might be sensitive and preferred to share it discreetly. Captain Thorne arrived within minutes, his professional demeanor masking any curiosity he might have felt about the princess's unusual request. Elena had chosen to meet in the palace library, both because it was familiar territory and because the public nature of the space would provide some protection if the conversation went badly. Captain Thorne, thank you for coming so quickly. I need to tell you something important about yesterday's security breach, but I'm afraid the truth is much more complicated than anyone realizes. The veteran security chief studied Elena's face carefully, noting the unusual seriousness in the 12-year-old's expression. Years of experience had taught him to recognize when someone was carrying a significant burden, regardless of their age. Princess, if you have information relevant to the investigation, I need you to tell me everything. Please don't worry about getting in trouble for anything you might have done. Right now, the truth is more important than protocol. Elena took a deep breath and began her account, starting with her discovery of the hidden letters and proceeding through her observations of Isabella's secret meetings and suspicious documentation. She spoke with the precision of someone who had rehearsed their story carefully, providing specific details and presenting her physical evidence in an organized manner. Captain Thorne listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave as Elena's account unfolded. The princess's evidence was compelling, and her analysis demonstrated a level of sophistication that surprised him. More importantly, her description of events aligned with several anomalies he had noticed but hadn't previously connected. Princess, these are very serious accusations. The evidence you've presented suggests coordinated activity that could constitute a threat to the monarchy itself. However, I need to ask you directly, are you certain about what you observed? Misunderstanding adult conversations or misinterpreting official documents could lead to conclusions that seem sinister but actually have innocent explanations. Elena had anticipated this question and had her response prepared. Captain, I understand that my age might make my accusations seem unreliable. However, I've documented everything carefully and I have photographic evidence of documents that I believe you can verify independently. I'm not asking you to act solely on my word. I'm asking you to investigate whether my observations correspond to verifiable facts. Captain Thorne was impressed by Elena's measured response. The princess was clearly frightened, but was presenting her case with remarkable composure. Her request for independent verification rather than immediate action demonstrated wisdom beyond her years. Princess, if your suspicions are correct, then you've potentially uncovered a conspiracy that could threaten the stability of the kingdom. However, investigating these claims will require extreme discretion. If the queen consort is indeed involved in activities that threaten royal security, then approaching her directly could be dangerous for both of us. Elena felt a surge of relief at Captain Thorne's words. His willingness to consider her accusations seriously suggested that he would conduct a proper investigation rather than simply reporting her suspicions to Isabella. What do you need me to do, Captain? I understand that this situation is dangerous, and I want to help in any way that doesn't make things worse. First, I need you to maintain your normal routine and avoid any actions that might alert the queen consort to our conversation. Second, if you observe anything else that seems relevant, document it carefully, but don't take any risks to gather additional evidence. Third, if anyone asks you about our meeting today, tell them you wanted to provide additional details about your library visit yesterday. Elena nodded, feeling more hopeful than she had since discovering the hidden documents. Having Captain Thorne's support and protection gave her confidence that the truth would eventually emerge, regardless of Isabella's carefully laid plans. Captain, there's one more thing you should know. Isabella has arranged for a psychological evaluation this afternoon with Dr. Webb. She claims it's because I seemed distressed after yesterday's events, but the timing seems suspicious given that it would prevent me from attending Uncle Richard's public ceremony. Captain Thorne's expression hardened at this information. If the queen consort was indeed involved in suspicious activities, then isolating Princess Elena under the guise of medical care would be a logical next step. The captain realized that he needed to accelerate his investigation significantly. Princess, I want you to cooperate with Dr. Webb's evaluation, but be careful about how much you reveal about your recent observations. If he asks about your activities or state of mind, focus on general topics rather than specific events. Can you do that? Yes, Captain. I understand. As Captain Thorne prepared to leave, Elena felt compelled to voice one final concern. Captain, if something happens to me, if I'm sent away for treatment, or if there's some kind of accident, please remember what I've told you today. Please make sure Uncle Richard knows the truth. The veteran security chief looked into the princess's young face and saw courage that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to protecting the royal family. Princess, I give you my word that nothing will happen to you while you're under my protection. And I promise that if your suspicions prove correct, the appropriate people will be held accountable for their actions. After Captain Thorne left, Elena returned to her chambers feeling both relieved and apprehensive. She had taken the first crucial step in exposing Isabella's conspiracy, but she knew the most dangerous phase was just beginning. Her stepmother was experienced in political maneuvering and would undoubtedly have contingency plans for various scenarios. Isabella, meanwhile, had spent the morning implementing the final stages of her accelerated timeline. Communications had been sent to key allies, important documents had been relocated to secure locations, and contingency plans had been activated. The queen consort was prepared for various outcomes, including the possibility that Princess Elena might prove more troublesome than initially anticipated. Dr. Webb arrived at the palace precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying with him the professional credentials and demeanor that would lend authority to whatever conclusions Isabella needed him to reach. The psychological evaluation had been carefully orchestrated to provide justification for removing Elena from the palace environment, ostensibly for treatment, but actually to prevent her from interfering with the final implementation of the conspiracy. As Elena prepared to face Dr. Webb's evaluation, she drew strength from knowing that Captain Thorne was aware of her suspicions and would be conducting his own investigation. The princess had done everything possible to ensure that the truth would emerge, regardless of what happened to her personally. The afternoon evaluation would prove to be a battle of wits between a clever 12-year-old and an experienced adult who believed he was protecting the kingdom from a disturbed child's delusions. Neither Elena nor Dr. Webb fully understood the stakes involved, but their conversation would ultimately determine whether Isabella's conspiracy would succeed or whether the princess's courage would save the monarchy from internal betrayal. The game had reached its most critical phase, with each player making moves that would determine the fate of the kingdom and the future of the royal family. Dr. Marcus Webb entered the palace library where Isabella had arranged for his evaluation of Princess Elena. The distinguished psychologist carried with him years of experience treating aristocratic children and a carefully cultivated reputation for discretion. Isabella had briefed him extensively about Elena's recent behavior, painting a picture of a child whose imagination had begun to blur dangerously with reality. Elena sat in one of the leather reading chairs, her posture reflecting the royal deportment training she had received since early childhood. She had spent the hours since her meeting with Captain Thorne preparing for this psychological evaluation, knowing that her responses would likely determine whether she remained free to help with the investigation or found herself isolated under medical supervision. Princesa Imbe, your stepmother asked me to speak with you because she's concerned about some distressing experiences you may have had recently. I want you to know that our conversation is confidential, and I'm here to help you work through any difficult feelings you might be experiencing. Elena studied Dr. Webb's face carefully, recognizing the practiced empathy that characterized professional counselors. She had interacted with enough palace advisors and officials to understand when adults had predetermined conclusions about her capabilities and concerns. Thank you for coming, Dr. Webb. I understand that my stepmother is worried about my behavior yesterday. I was indeed upset by the security emergency, but I think my reactions were quite normal given the circumstances. Dr. Webb noted Elena's articulate response and formal manner. Isabella had warned him that the princess was intellectually precocious, which sometimes manifested in elaborate fantasy scenarios that seemed convincing due to her sophisticated vocabulary and logical presentation. Can you tell me about what specifically upset you during yesterday's events? Sometimes children experience fear or anxiety in ways that adults might not immediately understand. Elena had anticipated this line of questioning and had prepared her responses carefully. She needed to appear psychologically stable while avoiding any discussion of her actual discoveries about Isabella's conspiracy. I was concerned about the security breach because it made me realize how vulnerable we all are in the palace. The idea that someone could enter private chambers without detection reminded me of historical accounts I've studied about palace coups and assassination attempts. I suppose my knowledge of history made the situation seem more threatening than it might have appeared to someone without that background. Dr. Webb made notes while Elena spoke, impressed by her articulate analysis, but also noting what he interpreted as obsessive focus on historical precedents for political violence. Isabella had mentioned the princess's tendency to draw dramatic parallels between current events and historical incidents. That's a very sophisticated understanding of security concerns, Princess. However, sometimes when we have extensive knowledge about historical dangers, we might begin to see similar threats in situations that are actually quite safe. Have you been worried that current events in the palace might parallel some of the historical incidents you've studied? Elena recognized the subtle trap in Dr. Webb's question. He was trying to determine whether she had developed paranoid delusions about contemporary threats based on her historical knowledge. Her response needed to demonstrate rational thinking while avoiding any mention of her actual observations about Isabella. I think studying history helps us understand patterns of human behavior, but I don't believe we're currently facing the same kinds of threats that existed in previous centuries. The security measures in place today are much more sophisticated, and the political environment is completely different. Dr. Webb continued his evaluation for another 30 minutes, probing Elena's thoughts about palace life, her relationship with Isabella, and her understanding of current political situations. The princess navigated each question carefully, demonstrating psychological stability while revealing nothing about her investigation into her stepmother's activities. As the session concluded, Dr. Webb felt confident in his preliminary assessment. Princess Elena showed no signs of psychological instability or delusional thinking. Her responses were measured, rational, and demonstrated healthy skepticism about dramatic interpretations of events. The evaluation suggested that Isabella's concerns might have been overstated, possibly reflecting the queen consort's own anxieties rather than genuine problems with Elena's mental state. Princess, I want to thank you for your cooperation today. Based on our conversation, I believe you're handling recent stressful events quite well. I don't see any indication that you need psychological intervention at this time. Elena felt enormous relief at Dr. Webb's conclusion, but she also recognized that his assessment might complicate Isabella's plans in ways that could prove dangerous. If the psychological evaluation didn't provide justification for isolating Elena, her stepmother would need to find alternative methods for preventing interference with her conspiracy. Dr. Webb, will you be sharing your assessment with my stepmother? I prefer that she not worry unnecessarily about my mental state. Of course, Princess. I'll prepare a brief report indicating that you appear to be coping well with recent events and don't require any special interventions at this time. After Dr. Webb left, Elena remained in the library, using the quiet environment to consider her next moves. Captain Thorne would likely contact her soon with updates about his investigation, and she needed to be prepared to assist without appearing to deviate from her normal routine. Isabella received Dr. Webb's preliminary report within the hour, and her reaction was far from pleased. The psychologist's assessment eliminated her planned justification for removing Elena from the palace environment, forcing her to consider more direct approaches to neutralizing the threat posed by the curious princess. Victoria Chambers arrived for an emergency consultation as Isabella digested the implications of Dr. Webb's evaluation. The two women met in Isabella's private study, a room that had been swept for surveillance devices and was considered secure for sensitive discussions. The psychological evaluation backfired, Isabella reported curtly. Dr. Webb found no evidence of mental instability or delusional thinking. Elena presented herself as rational and well-adjusted, which eliminates our justification for removing her from the palace. Victoria considered the implications carefully. That actually confirms our suspicions about her intelligence and sophistication. A truly disturbed child wouldn't have been able to manipulate the evaluation so skillfully. The fact that she presented herself as completely normal suggests she understood exactly what was at stake, which means she's potentially more dangerous than we initially realized. We need to assume that she's documented her discoveries and possibly shared them with someone else. Our accelerated timeline needs to be compressed even further. The two women spent the next hour reviewing contingency plans and emergency protocols. Isabella's conspiracy had always included provisions for various complications, but a threat from within the royal family itself required particularly delicate handling. Meanwhile, Captain Thorne had begun his discreet investigation into Elena's allegations. Using his security clearance and administrative access, he started by verifying the princess's claims about unusual document storage and suspicious meetings. What he discovered confirmed several of Elena's observations and revealed additional anomalies that he had previously overlooked. The security chief found evidence of irregular financial transfers, unauthorized communications with foreign contacts, and modifications to palace security protocols that served no apparent legitimate purpose. Most disturbing were subtle changes to succession documentation that appeared designed to create confusion about royal inheritance procedures. Captain Thorne realized that Princess Elena had indeed uncovered a sophisticated conspiracy that threatened the fundamental stability of the monarchy. The scope and coordination required for such an operation suggested involvement by experienced political operatives with significant resources and long-term planning capabilities. As evening approached, Captain Thorne made the difficult decision to expand his investigation by contacting Prince Richard directly. The king's brother needed to be informed about the potential threat, and his political experience would be essential for determining appropriate responses to the conspiracy. Using secure communication protocols reserved for genuine emergencies, Captain Thorne sent a coded message requesting an urgent private meeting with Prince Richard. The message contained enough specific information to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing details that could be intercepted by hostile parties. Elena spent the evening in her chambers, maintaining her normal routine while internally preparing for whatever developments might emerge from Captain Thorne's investigation. The princess understood that the next 24 hours would likely determine whether Isabella's conspiracy succeeded or whether the truth would emerge in time to prevent irreversible damage to the kingdom. As the palace settled into its nighttime rhythm, all the key players were implementing their final preparations. Isabella and Victoria worked through the night, coordinating with their network of allies and preparing to implement emergency measures that would consolidate their control over the monarchy. Captain Thorne compiled evidence and prepared briefings that would demonstrate the scope of the threat. Elena documented her continued observations while maintaining the appearance of normal adolescent activities. The stage was set for a climactic confrontation that would determine whether a 12-year-old princess's courage and curiosity could overcome years of sophisticated political manipulation. The fate of the kingdom hung in the balance, with each side preparing for a final confrontation that would reshape the future of the monarchy. Prince Richard received Captain Thorne's urgent message during a diplomatic dinner, and the coded language immediately conveyed the gravity of the situation. The prince excused himself from the formal event and began making arrangements for an emergency return to the capital, understanding that his family's security and the stability of the kingdom might depend on his rapid response to whatever crisis had emerged. The final act of the conspiracy was about to begin, with all participants moving toward a confrontation that would test whether truth and loyalty could triumph over ambition and deception in the halls of power. Prince Richard arrived at the palace at dawn, his diplomatic convoy having traveled through the night in response to Captain Thorne's urgent summons. The gravity of the situation became clear during his secure briefing with the security chief, as evidence of Isabella's conspiracy unfolded in devastating detail. The prince's years of political experience allowed him to immediately grasp the implications of what Elena had discovered and what Captain Thorne had subsequently verified. This level of coordination suggests months or possibly years of planning, Prince Richard observed as he reviewed the documentation. Isabella has positioned herself to exploit succession uncertainties while maintaining plausible deniability about her involvement. The sophistication required for this operation indicates significant external support. Captain Thorne nodded grimly. Princess Elena's initial discoveries provided the key that allowed us to identify patterns we had previously missed. Without her courage in coming forward, this conspiracy might have succeeded without detection until it was too late to prevent. Elena, meanwhile, had awoken to find the palace atmosphere subtly but noticeably changed. Additional security personnel had appeared overnight, and the morning routine carried an undercurrent of tension that suggested significant developments had occurred while she slept. Lady Margaret's demeanor reflected concern and protective vigilance that indicated she had been briefed about potential dangers. Isabella recognized the signs of an active security investigation and understood that her carefully constructed plans were under threat. Years of political maneuvering had taught her to identify when situations were developing beyond her control, and the increased security presence suggested that her conspiracy had been discovered. Rather than attempting to maintain her cover story, Isabella decided to implement her final contingency plan. If she could not consolidate control through gradual manipulation, she would need to act decisively to eliminate threats and seize power through more direct means. The plan required perfect timing and absolute commitment, as failure would mean complete exposure and severe consequences. Victoria Chambers coordinated the final phase of their operation, activating cells of supporters who had been positioned throughout the government and palace administration. The network Isabella had cultivated over years of careful relationship building would attempt to seize control of critical communications and administrative functions simultaneously. At 9 o'clock in the morning, Elena was summoned to the main throne room for what Lady Margaret described as an important family meeting. The princess understood that this gathering would likely determine the outcome of everything she had set in motion through her discovery of the hidden documents. Prince Richard, Captain Thorne, Isabella, and several senior palace officials were assembled when Elena arrived. The formal setting and serious expressions made clear that this was not a routine family discussion. Elena took her designated seat with the composure she had learned through years of royal protocol training, though her heart raced with anticipation and fear. Princess Elena. Prince Richard began with the authority that came from his position as senior royal family member in the king's absence. We understand that you have made some serious observations about activities within the palace. We need you to share everything you have discovered, without fear of consequences and with complete honesty. Elena looked around the room, assessing the faces of those present. Isabella's expression remained perfectly controlled, but the princess could detect the cold calculation behind her stepmother's diplomatic mask. Captain Thorne nodded encouragingly, his presence providing the support Elena needed to speak truthfully about what she had witnessed. Uncle Richard, I discovered hidden documents that suggest coordination between my stepmother and external parties to manipulate succession procedures and palace security. I have photographic evidence of these documents, as well as recordings of conversations I overheard that discuss timing, coordination, and methods for implementing what appears to be a political conspiracy. Isabella maintained her composure while internally calculating her remaining options. Elena's direct accusation in front of Prince Richard and senior officials eliminated any possibility of dismissing the princess's claims as childish fantasies. The conspiracy had been exposed, and Isabella would need to shift to damage control and strategic retreat. These are very serious accusations, Princess, Isabella responded with perfect calm. I'm concerned that your imagination and extensive reading about historical conspiracies may have led you to misinterpret normal political discussions and administrative documents. Perhaps we should examine this supposed evidence before drawing dramatic conclusions. Elena had anticipated this response and was prepared with her documentation. She presented the photographs, transcripts, and analysis she had compiled, explaining each piece of evidence clearly and demonstrating the patterns that had led to her conclusions about Isabella's activities. Prince Richard and Captain Thorne reviewed the evidence carefully, their expressions growing increasingly grave as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. The documentation provided undeniable proof of coordinated planning, unauthorized communications, and systematic preparation for activities that could only be described as treasonous. Isabella, Prince Richard addressed the Queen Consort with the formal authority of his royal position. This evidence demonstrates activities that constitute a direct threat to the monarchy and the security of the kingdom. Do you wish to provide any explanation for these documents and communications before I implement emergency security protocols? Isabella realized that her position had become untenable, but she maintained her dignity and composure even as her carefully constructed plans collapsed around her. Years of political experience had taught her that defeat sometimes required strategic retreat rather than futile resistance. I believe there has been a significant misunderstanding of legitimate political activities, Isabella replied carefully. However, I recognize that these accusations require thorough investigation. I am prepared to cooperate fully with any official inquiry into my conduct. Captain Thorne stepped forward with additional evidence that his team had compiled during the night. Your Majesty, we have identified a network of conspirators positioned throughout the government and palace administration. Victoria Chambers was apprehended this morning while attempting to implement what appears to have been a coordinated plan to seize control of communications and administrative functions. Elena watched as the adults around her processed the full implications of what she had uncovered. Her initial curiosity about hidden palace passages had revealed a conspiracy that threatened the very foundations of their kingdom. The 12-year-old princess felt a mixture of pride in her investigative success and overwhelming relief that the truth had finally been exposed. Prince Richard took control of the situation with the decisive authority that royal crises demanded. Isabella, you are hereby relieved of all official duties and will remain under palace security supervision pending a full investigation. Captain Thorne, implement emergency security protocols and ensure that all members of this conspiracy are apprehended and questioned. As security personnel moved to escort Isabella from the throne room, she paused to address Elena directly. Princess, you have demonstrated remarkable courage and intelligence in pursuing what you believe to be the truth. I hope you will remember that political situations are often more complex than they initially appear. Elena met her stepmother's gaze without flinching. I hope you will remember that loyalty to the kingdom sometimes requires difficult choices, even when they hurt people we care about. After Isabella's departure, Prince Richard addressed Elena with both respect and concern. "Princess, your actions have potentially saved the kingdom from a serious threat. However, I need you to understand the gravity of what has occurred and the importance of discretion as we move forward. Uncle Richard, I understand that this situation will require careful handling. I'm prepared to provide whatever additional assistance the investigation requires, and I will follow whatever guidance you think is appropriate regarding public disclosure." Captain Thorne added his own assessment. Princess Elena demonstrated remarkable maturity and courage throughout this crisis. Her decision to document evidence carefully and approach appropriate authorities rather than acting impulsively likely prevented more serious consequences. Over the following days, the full scope of Isabella's conspiracy was revealed through systematic investigation. The network of collaborators had planned to manipulate succession procedures, compromise palace security, and ultimately position Isabella as regent with unprecedented power over the monarchy. The sophistication of their operation suggested years of planning and significant external support from foreign interests. Elena found herself thrust into a complex political situation that required maturity beyond her 12 years. The princess worked closely with investigators to provide detailed accounts of everything she had observed, helping to piece together the complete picture of how the conspiracy had been designed to operate. The public revelation of the plot created a significant political crisis that required careful management to maintain stability and confidence in the monarchy. Prince Richard worked with government officials to ensure that appropriate legal proceedings were conducted while protecting the reputation and security of the royal family. Elena's role in exposing the conspiracy became a closely guarded secret, with only essential personnel aware of how the investigation had begun. The princess understood that her age and position made it necessary to protect her from public attention that could prove overwhelming or dangerous. As the immediate crisis subsided, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with simple curiosity about palace history and had ultimately led to uncovering a threat to the kingdom itself. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about courage, responsibility, and the importance of speaking truth to power when the stakes are highest. The kingdom had been saved by the unlikely combination of a child's curiosity, a security chief's integrity, and a prince's decisive action. Isabella's conspiracy had been defeated not through sophisticated intelligence operations or political maneuvering, but through the simple courage of a 12-year-old princess who refused to ignore evidence of wrongdoing, regardless of the personal risks involved. Elena's actions had demonstrated that protecting democracy and justice sometimes falls to the most unexpected heroes, and that age and position are less important than character and determination when facing threats to everything one holds dear. The young princess had proven herself worthy of the royal legacy she would one day inherit, having already shown the courage and wisdom necessary to protect the kingdom from those who would exploit it for their own ends. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.